like dust after an explosion when the damage has already been done, but no one's acknowledged it yet. That was the silence in Margaret Hale's house that morning. At 64, Margaret had always believed in duty, in folded linens, warm meals, and remembering birthdays without being reminded. For 42 years, she'd loved her husband Edward, raised their son Daniel with care, and kept a home that had seen generations pass through its doors. But in recent months, the warmth had cooled. Edward had become distant, work late, he'd mutter, barely meeting her eyes. And Daniel? He was wrapped so tightly around his beautiful wife Celia's finger that he barely noticed when his mother's birthday passed without a call. Margaret, however, noticed everything. And when the phone rang that morning, with Lily Brooks' voice trembling on the other end, Margaret knew something was about to break. "Can I come over? Just you and me. It's important." Lily was Celia's older sister. While they had always been cordial, they were not close. But there was something in Lily's tone, something urgent, frightened even, that made Margaret set the good china on the table, pull out the cream linen tablecloth, and slice the lemon cake Lily had once complimented during Easter brunch. The doorbell rang. Lily stood there pale, clutching her purse like a lifeline, her usually flawless makeup smudged just beneath the eyes. Margaret offered her a warm smile, the kind she'd perfected over decades of being the calm in everyone else's storm. "Come in, dear. I've made your favorite sandwiches." Lily barely acknowledged the gesture. Her hands trembled as she sat. She didn't reach for the food, didn't sip the tea. She simply sat there, hands clasped, eyes heavy with something that looked like guilt. "Lily," Margaret said gently, "what is it?" Lily met her eyes then, green eyes filled with pain, regret, and something else that twisted Margaret's stomach. Love. Not romantic, not familial, but the kind of love that compels someone to speak the truth, no matter how much it might burn everything down. "It's about Celia and Edward." The world seemed to tilt. Margaret's hands gripped the edge of the table to keep herself steady. "They're having an affair." The words hit her like a splash of ice water to the face. But Margaret didn't scream. She didn't sob, she simply blinked and asked, "Are you certain?" Lily nodded, her voice cracking. "I saw them at a cafe downtown. They were holding hands, kissing. They weren't trying to hide it." Margaret's jaw clenched, but her voice remained steady. "Have you told Daniel?" "No," Lily whispered. "I don't know if I should. It would crush him." Margaret stood, walked slowly to the window, overlooking the rose garden she and Edward had planted in their youth. The blooms were in full color, red, white, blush, each one a lie now. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked without turning around. Lily's voice cracked. "Because you deserve the truth, because I can't pretend anymore. And because I love my nephew, he deserves to know the woman he married is manipulating everyone." Margaret turned then, eyes not soft but steel. "Does Celia know you're here?" "No, she thinks I'm at work." "Good. It needs to stay that way." Lily blinked, startled by the calm authority in Margaret's voice. "I need you to do something very difficult," Margaret continued, returning to her seat. "I need you to pretend this conversation never happened. Not for long, just until I'm ready." Lily hesitated, then nodded. "What about Daniel? What about your marriage?" Margaret lifted her teacup to her lips. Her hands were steady now. "Some battles aren't won with raised voices, dear. Sometimes the most powerful move is silence, the kind that makes your enemies think they've already won." That night, Edward came home to the smell of pot roast and carrots, his favorite. He loosened his tie, kissed her cheek, and asked, "Long day." "Nothing unusual," Margaret replied, and she meant it. The unusual had already happened, it was just that he didn't know it yet. At dinner, they spoke of Daniel's upcoming vacation. Edward seemed distracted, his eyes flicking to his phone more than usual. Margaret noticed his new cologne, the one she didn't buy. She noticed he no longer looked at her when he spoke. And yet, she smiled. She listened. She carved his meat. She would not confront him, not yet. She would let him believe his deception had gone unnoticed. She would let Celia twirl through family dinners like a golden actress, performing devotion with every false smile. And she would let Daniel, sweet, trusting Daniel, keep his illusions for now. But inside, Margaret Hale was changing. A storm was forming behind her eyes, slow and deliberate. She had spent a lifetime smoothing over conflict, avoiding drama. But some betrayals demanded more than grace, they demanded strategy. And she had just become a player in a game no one knew she was watching. 3 days passed. 3 days in which Margaret Hale smiled, served meals, and went about her routines with such precision that no one suspected the truth behind her eyes. She had become a ghost in her own life, quiet, observant, and increasingly dangerous to those who had underestimated her. On the 3rd day, it was Sunday family dinner night. Celia always insisted on helping in the kitchen, always made a show of gratitude and warmth. It had once charmed Margaret. Now it only made her stomach turn. The doorbell rang just after 3. Margaret opened it to find Celia, dazzling as ever in a sleek designer dress, her blonde hair styled into soft curls that danced around her shoulders. She stepped inside like she owned the house, and one day she thought she would. "Margaret, you look beautiful," Celia gushed, leaning in for an air kiss. "And these flowers, stunning. You always have the most elegant taste." Margaret returned her hug with polite warmth, noting the expensive perfume on Celia's skin, the same scent she had smelled on Edward's shirts lately. "Thank you, dear. Wade should be here soon. Would you like a glass of wine while we wait?" "That would be lovely." Celia perched herself at the kitchen island, crossing her legs with slow, practiced elegance. "Actually," she said after a sip, "I was hoping we could talk, just us girls." Margaret gave no hint of alarm. She poured herself a glass and took the stool opposite her. "Of course, what's on your mind?" Celia leaned forward conspiratorially, her voice gentle and full of faux concern. "I've just been worried about you and Edward lately. There's been a tension in the air. And well, after so many years together, I imagine it's normal. But still, marriage can be difficult when the spark fades, can't it?" The audacity made Margaret's fingers twitch, but she kept her face neutral. "Yes," she murmured, "I suppose it can." Celia took that as encouragement. "Have you thought about, therapy, or maybe just what might make you both happier in the long run?" Margaret turned her wine glass slowly in her hands. "You mean divorce?" Celia blinked, caught off guard by the directness. "No, of course not," she backtracked quickly. "I'm just saying life is too short to be unhappy. You deserve someone who truly appreciates you. We all do." Margaret smiled, slow and knowing. "That's very thoughtful of you, Celia. I just care about this family so much. And Daniel, he'd want both his parents to be happy, even if that means being apart." Margaret sipped her wine and nodded, cataloging every word, every gesture, every manipulative breath. When Daniel arrived, Celia transformed effortlessly, her arms around him, her laugh just a touch too loud, her eyes wide with admiration. Margaret watched her closely, the way she tilted her head, the way she leaned in, and how her gaze flicked, almost involuntarily, toward the door at the sound of Edward's car. Edward was 20 minutes late, offering an apologetic smile as he entered the dining room. "Sorry, got tied up at the office," he explained, kissing Margaret's cheek and taking his seat. "No problem," Daniel said. "We were just talking about our trip." "Where are you thinking of going?" Edward asked, now interested. "Somewhere warm," Celia said, her voice softer now. "A place we can escape." She didn't look at Daniel when she said it. She looked at Edward. Margaret served dinner: roast beef, garlic potatoes, and green beans, her hands as steady as ever. She chewed slowly, listened attentively, and said all the right things. But behind her calm expression, she was watching them. Watching how Celia's fingers brushed Edward's wrist when she passed him the salt. Watching how Edward smiled a fraction longer than necessary at Celia's compliments. Watching how Daniel noticed none of it. After the meal, Margaret began clearing dishes with Daniel, while Edward and Celia lingered at the table. Their voices were low, too low. She strained to hear through the clatter of dishes and running water. "We can't keep doing this," Celia hissed. "Just a little longer," Edward replied. "She suspects nothing." They were wrong. She knew everything. But she dried the plates and loaded the dishwasher like any other Sunday night, humming softly under her breath, as if she were none the wiser. The next morning, Margaret made an appointment. Not with the family lawyer, Edward's old friend, but with a woman she'd found through discreet referrals. Patricia Chen, a sharp, well-respected attorney known for handling high-stakes divorce cases with discretion and tenacity. Patricia's office sat on the 10th floor of a downtown high-rise, far from the familiar cafes and legal offices Margaret usually frequented. She liked that. It made her feel protected. "Why haven't you confronted him?" Patricia asked after hearing everything. Margaret folded her hands in her lap. "Because I want to know exactly what I'm dealing with. I need to know what belongs to me, what he thinks he can take, what he has no idea he's about to lose." Patricia nodded, impressed. "Smart approach. Let's start with the trust." They spent the next hour reviewing documents. Margaret had come prepared, with papers her grandfather had signed, the trust he'd created decades ago to protect their family legacy. "Interesting," Patricia murmured, flipping through the pages. "Your grandfather was meticulous." "Yes," Margaret said softly. "He believed some things should never fall into the wrong hands. And he had been right." Because embedded deep within the trust was a clause Margaret herself had almost forgotten. In the event of adultery, the innocent spouse retained all trust-protected assets. Edward would lose everything: the house, the business tied to the property, even the vacation cabin he loved. If she could prove the affair, everything would be hers. And Margaret Hale intended to prove it. By the time Margaret stepped out of Patricia Chen's office, her entire posture had changed. Gone was the woman who had once only known how to preserve peace and endure wounds in silence. In her place walked someone sharper, someone forged in betrayal and now armed with strategy. The late afternoon sun filtered through the buildings as she crossed the street to her car, a small smile tugging at her lips. Edward and Celia thought they were winning. They believed they de-manipulated her into surrender. What they didn't know was that she had just loaded the board with pieces they didn't even realize existed. And she wasn't playing checkers. She was playing chess. At home that evening, Edward was already seated at the kitchen table, skimming through the newspaper like it mattered. He looked up and smiled faintly as she entered, lifting the lid of the pot roast she'd left warming in the oven. "You spoil me," he said, as if he still had the right to affection. Margaret only smiled and set the table with the same care she'd always shown. She poured 2 glasses of wine. Not because she wanted to toast with him, but because it was the kind of detail that made the mask more convincing. "I've been thinking," she said casually, slicing into the roast. "About what?" Edward didn't look up. "About us. About what Celia said the other night. Maybe it is time we considered a change." He glanced up sharply, and Margaret caught it, that glimmer of anticipation in his eyes, the flicker of hope he tried to mask. "Are you saying you want a divorce?" "I'm saying," she replied, voice serene, "maybe it's time for us both to find what makes us happy." He reached across the table and touched her hand, not with affection, but with relief. "If that's what you want, Margaret, I support you." Liar, she thought. She smiled. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret played her role perfectly, the gentle wife facing the end of a long marriage with grace. No tears, no accusations, no bitterness, just soft nods, polite conversations, and firm suggestions that they proceed with dignity. She let Edward choose the lawyer. Richard Petton, the same man who played golf with Edward on weekends, who had toasted their anniversary just 3 years earlier. A convenient choice and a predictable one. Margaret didn't object. She made no demands. She knew exactly what they were expecting. At the settlement meeting, she wore pale blue, calm, elegant, unthreatening. Her hands were folded on the table as Petton laid out the equitable division of assets. It was a performance, and they were proud of their choreography. Edward would keep the family home, the business, the investments. Margaret would get the small condo downtown and a modest alimony. "Given Mr. Hale's role as primary breadwinner," Petton said smoothly, "this is a standard, reasonable settlement. It avoids protracted legal drama." Margaret flipped through the thick stack of documents with a serene expression. They thought she was broken. They thought she was grateful for the scraps. And when she finally said, "Where do I sign?" they all exhaled too soon. Even Celia, seated at the far end of the table beside Daniel, gave her a saccharine smile, eyes gleaming with premature victory. "You're very strong, Margaret," she said softly. "This kind of maturity isn't easy." Margaret returned the smile. "Thank you, Celia. It means a lot coming from you." She signed every page with steady strokes. Each letter of her name a silent declaration. You think this is over. It hasn't even begun. Outside the building, Daniel hugged her tightly. "Mom, are you really okay with all this?" Margaret touched his cheek, the boy she had raised to believe in goodness. "Sweetheart, sometimes you win more by walking away than by staying in the fight." Celia looped her arm around Daniel's waist, radiating smugness. "Margaret's going to love the downtown condo. We'll help her pack and get settled. She won't have to worry about upkeep or repairs anymore." "It'll be nice for you," Celia continued, "to be somewhere peaceful with people your own age." Margaret gave her a long, serene look. "Yes, dear, peace is exactly what I need." She watched them walk away, already imagining their future. They believed they were marching toward victory. They were, in fact, marching straight into a legal ambush. 2 weeks later, Daniel appeared on her doorstep. His eyes were hollow. His hands trembled. He looked like a man who had been gutted. "Mom, I need to talk to you." Margaret guided him in silently, heart heavy but unsurprised. "She's been lying to me," Daniel whispered, collapsing onto the living room sofa. All this time, she and Dad. It came out in sobs, in pieces. The messages he had found, the dates, the timeline, the betrayal. When he finally looked up at her, eyes full of pain, he asked, "How are you not falling apart?" Margaret sat beside him and took his hand. Because I already did, and now I'm standing up. He stared at her. You knew. I knew, she said softly, and I prepared. That night, Margaret opened the drawer where she kept the trust documents. She would show Daniel everything. The clause, the proof, the strategy. The game was no longer just hers to play. Now she had an ally, and the end game was coming. The morning sun glinted off the polished glass of Pettin and Associates. The firm Edward had chosen, the one he believed would secure his future. Inside its marble-lined walls, another chapter was about to unfold. But what Edward didn't know, what Celia couldn't possibly suspect, was that Margaret Hale had already rewritten the ending. She stepped into the conference room with the calm of someone who'd already won. Patricia Chen followed behind her, silent but formidable. Every document, every legal clause, every trust provision was neatly organized in her briefcase, a quiet arsenal waiting to be revealed. Edward was already seated at the table, phone in hand, flipping through emails as if he didn't have the most consequential meeting of his life ahead. He looked up briefly. "Margaret," he nodded. "Thanks for coming." She gave a small smile, not warm, not cold, just unreadable. Celia sat next to Daniel, who looked paler than usual but composed. His hands were folded tightly in his lap. Margaret could feel his eyes on her, silently asking, "Is this it? Is today the day?" She gave him the smallest nod. "Yes, today the curtain falls." Richard Pettin adjusted his tie and cleared his throat. "Let's begin," he said, sliding a new folder across the table. "This contains the finalized asset, allocations based on our last agreement. Nothing has changed substantially, but we wanted everything in writing before filing with the court." Margaret didn't reach for the folder. Instead, Patricia opened her own. "Actually," she said smoothly, "there have been some developments." Edward blinked. "I beg your pardon. We're formally submitting a new claim to the court. One that challenges the initial settlement based on previously undisclosed terms of a legal trust connected to Mrs. Hale's family estate." Pettin stiffened. "That trust has nothing to do with this divorce." "Actually, it has everything to do with it," Patricia said, sliding a copy of the trust across the table. "This document predates the marriage. The Hale family home, several investment properties, and the founding capital for the business all trace back to assets protected under this trust." Edward's eyes narrowed as he read. "That can't be. We've lived in that house for 40 years. I built the business. No," Margaret interrupted softly. "You operated the business. I inherited it. And the deed to the house, which you never read closely, has always remained in the name of the Hale Family Trust." Celia leaned forward, eyes sharp. "Wait, are you saying none of it belongs to him?" Patricia didn't even glance her way. "Under the terms of the trust, any spouse who initiates divorce due to marital dissatisfaction retains only a shared interest. However," she tapped a highlighted section, "if the marriage ends as a result of adultery and the innocent party can prove it, the unfaithful spouse forfeits all rights to trust assets." Edward went pale. "You can't prove that." Margaret placed a sealed envelope on the table. Inside were photographs, time-stamped emails, credit card receipts, a detailed timeline cross-referenced with Celia's movements and Edward's absences. "I didn't come here to destroy you, Edward," Margaret said, her voice steady. "I came here to protect what belongs to my family, what you tried to take through lies." Celia's voice cracked like glass. "This is insane. You're trying to steal it all." "No," Margaret said, turning to face her. "You tried to. You lied to my son. You seduced my husband, and you thought I was too old and too soft to notice." Pettin's voice wavered. "We'll need time to review this." "Of course," Patricia said crisply. "But in the meantime, we're filing an injunction to freeze all transfers of property and assets tied to the trust." Edward stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "You planned this," he hissed. "I endured it," Margaret replied, "and I waited." Outside the office, Daniel walked beside his mother in silence. Only when they reached the elevator did he speak. "You could have destroyed him years ago. Why now?" Margaret looked up at her son, her boy who had inherited his father's smile, but not his betrayal. "Because before now, I didn't know who I was fighting for." Daniel's eyes filled with quiet understanding. "Thank you," he whispered, "for fighting for us, even when I didn't see it." She pressed her hand to his cheek, just for a moment. "It was never about revenge, Daniel. It was about drawing a line." As the elevator doors opened, they stepped inside together, mother and son, leaving behind the illusion of a family that had already crumbled. What remained was real. Painful, yes, but true, and it would be the foundation for something stronger. The silence in Margaret's home that night was not the same silence it had been before. This one wasn't heavy or suffocating. It was watchful, alive, waiting. She sat by the window overlooking the rose garden. The same garden she and Edward had once tended together, back when love had been real and betrayal unthinkable. Now, the blooms swayed gently in the dusk, unconcerned with human lies, with the ashes of broken vows. It was Daniel's car that pierced the silence, pulling into the driveway without its usual cheer. Margaret rose to meet him, but when he stepped from the car, her heart stopped. His face, pale, drawn, was not the face of a man who had been hurt. It was the face of a man who had been shattered. "Daniel." Her voice barely reached him. He didn't answer. He walked up the steps slowly, like someone wading through wreckage. When he reached the porch, he didn't speak. He just handed her a manila folder, heavy, swollen with papers, and sat down. Only then did he whisper, "It was all real. Everything you said. Everything I didn't want to believe." Margaret didn't open the folder right away. She sat beside him, her hand gently resting on his. "Tell me." Daniel exhaled. "I found messages, Mom, hundreds of them, between Celia and Dad, dates, plans. They'd been plotting the divorce for months. Plotting how to make sure you got nothing." His voice cracked. "Celia bragged about it in one of the texts, said you were easy to outsmart, that she'd be mistress of this house soon, that you'd be in some retirement condo before Christmas." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, not in pain, in restraint. "How did you find all this?" "Lily," Daniel said. "She called me, told me where to look, what to search. At first, I didn't believe her. I thought she was just bitter. Jealous, maybe, but she was." "She was brave," Margaret said softly. Daniel nodded. "She said she couldn't watch her sister destroy the people who had welcomed her like family. She said you had protected this family long enough, and someone needed to protect you." Margaret felt something deep in her chest shift, something wounded, something that had gone quiet for too long. "Where is Celia now?" "Gone," Daniel said. "I confronted her. She didn't even try to deny it, just laughed. Said Dad could give her more than I ever could. Said I was too boring to matter." He looked down at his hands. "I told her to get out, gave her an hour to pack. She told me I'd regret it, that this house was hers now, that you de-signed it away." Margaret finally opened the folder. Inside were printouts of emails, screenshots of texts, even a copy of a life insurance policy, forged with Celia listed as the beneficiary. Her hand froze. "What is this?" Daniel's jaw clenched. "She forged your signature, took out a policy 6 months ago. Lily found it in her things. It's not just betrayal anymore, he added. It's criminal. Margaret stared at the paper, heart pounding in a new, colder rhythm. This wasn't about adultery anymore. This was premeditation. A knock on the door startled them both. Lily. Her face was pale, anxious, but she carried a folder of her own. I found more, she said quietly. She wasn't just planning to take your home. She was looking into your medical history. Your routine, even the medications you take. My God, Daniel whispered. Margaret was silent. Her hands were steady, but inside a fire was rising. We need to call the police, she said. Daniel nodded. Lily looked relieved. Detective Harper is already reviewing the documents. He said the forgery alone is enough for a felony charge. And the insurance policy. She didn't finish. She didn't need to. They all knew. Celia had planned to erase Margaret, not just from the house, not just from the family, but from existence. The next morning, Margaret stood in her kitchen. The same kitchen where Celia once offered to help pack up the fine china for her. Now it felt different, clean, sacred. As the sunlight streamed through the windows, Daniel and Lily joined her for coffee. There were no more secrets between them, only choices. We'll go to the police today, Daniel said. You won't have to do this alone, Mom. Margaret looked at them both, her son, who had finally seen the truth, and Lily, who had risked everything to expose it. Thank you, she said, for standing with me. And quietly, without fanfare, the three of them sat at the same table where betrayal had once whispered, now making plans for justice. Margaret had once believed betrayal would break her. She now knew better. It had refined her. And the reckoning, the one Celia and Edward thought they'd never face, had only just begun. The police investigation moved swiftly. What began as a betrayal of trust had become something far more sinister: fraud, forgery, and the intent to exploit and erase. When Detective Harper reviewed the documents Margaret and Daniel provided, he didn't hesitate. Within a week, Celia Brooke was arrested. The charges: insurance fraud, identity theft, conspiracy to defraud, and under quiet but mounting suspicion, attempted premeditated harm. Edward wasn't arrested, but he was named as a cooperating witness. His signature was on certain documents, his voice in recorded voicemails. He had enough plausible deniability to avoid prison, but not enough to escape disgrace. He lost the business. He lost the family home. He lost the respect of the only son he had ever raised. And most of all, he lost the woman who had once loved him without question. 6 months later, the Hale home bloomed again. The roses were brighter this spring, or maybe Margaret simply noticed them more. The air carried the scent of lavender and hope. The rooms were quiet, but no longer with absence. They were peaceful. Daniel came every weekend now, his visits warm and unhurried. And when Lily came with him, she no longer hovered at the edge of the family. She belonged, not because she had taken her sister's place, but because she had never pretended to be someone she was. She had shown her heart when it cost her most. Margaret watched them in the garden one Sunday afternoon, laughing as they trimmed hedges and planted new herbs. She didn't intrude, just smiled softly and watered her roses. Later, over dinner, Daniel raised a glass. To the house that refused to fall, and to the woman who made sure of it. Margaret chuckled. It wasn't just me. No, Lily said, but you were the root. Margaret looked down at the dining table, the same one where Celia had once plotted, where Edward had once lied. Now it hosted honesty, growth, healing. The condo from the divorce settlement sat untouched for months. Margaret had thought about selling it, but something about it, the irony, the redemption, made her pause. One evening, she called Patricia Chen. "I have an idea. I want to turn the condo into a refuge for women starting over. A place to land, to rebuild." Patricia's voice warmed. "That's beautiful and poetic, considering who tried to give you that consolation prize." "Let them think they handed me scraps," Margaret said. "I'll build something strong with them." And she did. Within weeks, volunteers joined the project. Donated books filled the shelves. Soft linens, warm lamps, a stocked kitchen. No grand signs, no bureaucracy, just a safe place. The first woman who walked through its doors was younger than Margaret had expected. Mid-30s, hollow eyes, a whisper of bruises still visible on her wrists. Margaret handed her a set of keys and a warm blanket. "You're safe here," she said. "You start again on your own terms." The woman cried, not from pain, from disbelief. As spring turned to summer, Margaret hosted a small gathering in her garden. Daniel and Lily brought food, neighbors brought wine, and laughter filled the spaces where sorrow once sat. Wade, now just Daniel again, stood before the group and cleared his throat. "I thought betrayal would define my life, but instead, it revealed something. That real strength doesn't shout, it watches, waits, then moves exactly when it must." He turned to his mother. "And you, Mom, you didn't just survive this, you transformed it. You showed us what it means to lose everything and still come out whole." Margaret stood, her hands folded gently before her. "I didn't win because I fought harder. I won because I finally stopped trying to protect people who didn't protect me. This home," she continued, "has seen betrayal. Yes, but it has also witnessed something far more powerful, renewal. And that, I hope, is what lingers in these walls." That night, as moonlight spread across her bedroom, Margaret opened the drawer that held her old wedding ring. The inscription still read, "Forever and always." She smiled sadly. Forever lasted 42 years, always ended the moment you chose her. She placed the ring not in anger, but in closure back into the velvet box, now resting beside a new one. A note from Daniel and Lily announcing their engagement. The garden would host another wedding soon. But this time, it would bloom not from deceit, but from honesty, resilience, and love earned. Margaret Hale was no longer just a wife, or a mother, or a survivor. She was a protector of legacy, a woman who knew that silence was not surrender, and that the strongest battles are often fought without ever raising your voice. She had been betrayed, she had been underestimated, and now she was reborn.